Shalom, my friends, and welcome to another episode of Parsha with Yehuda. This is the weekly Parsha, Parshat Vayeira, and this is a very popular Parsha for Christians to use to try and take out of context, to try and justify the worship of Jesus in the form of one of these three men, right? So they argue that because one of these men, typically, actually, I've heard some Christians actually argue that all three of these individuals are sort of like a part of the Trinity, which was a very interesting, fascinating take on this. A lot of people like to take this head on, right? They like to try and argue from a perspective of, isolating this passage and saying, oh, look, let's argue grammatically. Let's try and show the Christian from this passage that it can't. And there's a way to do that, but I find it more effective to simply use their logic against them, right? Because we know it's contextual abuse. So let's look at the New Testament, where it says in John chapter 14, this is Jesus speaking, right? And when Jesus speaks in the New Testament, Christians, their ears perk up. It says, "You heard me say, I am going away, and I am coming back to you. If you love me, you would be glad that I am going to the Father. For the Father is greater than I." Right? So if you bring that up to a Christian, they'll say, because obviously we're arguing that Jesus would be saying that he is not equivalent with, the idea of God, right? Of being God, because he is claiming subordination to the Father. The Christian would try and redefine what that means. It doesn't mean he's saying he's not, it's three separate persons, whatever. They'll make up some spiel to try and reconcile that, right? And they'll argue that we're taking it out of context. So that's really your strongest argument in Genesis 18, right? When they try to start this great Jesus angel hunt, because Jesus never claimed to be, every time there's an anonymous angel in the Tanakh, that means it's Jesus, right? That it's just simply not something that happened. Just because Jesus might have made a claim about Abraham not trying to kill him, right? That they'll argue that sometimes, that maybe Jesus made some vague statement to the Pharisees that Abraham didn't try to kill him. And they'll say, well, that means he was one of these angels. I mean, number one, that's not a strong one-to-one argument. That's just a vague statement. What does that mean? Oh, he's the angel who appeared to Abraham in the tent. It's a complete lapse in logic, right? And then on top of that, they don't have a standard for what constitutes which of these men or angels. How do you refer to them? Is there, is it the angel of the Lord, right? This is typically the argument that they will make in Exodus 23, right? They say that this is the angel of the Lord, and this is the way it's described, and who is the angel of the Lord? Well, it's not described that way here, right? So they don't really have a consistent standard as to how to determine which of these angels are actual angels, right? For example, the angels who, in the very next chapter, right, it says explicitly that angels, this is the next Aliyah, but when we get to chapter 19, it says, and the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, right? So the three men in the first Aliyah, right, in Genesis 18, they're all referred to as anashim, right, in the Hebrew, as men. They're not referred to as angels until later, right? So clearly there is a precedence for these men, and we see this multiple times, right? When you look in Genesis 32 with the story of Jacob wrestling with I can't remember exactly the chapter, but in Genesis 30 somewhere, Jacob wrestles with a man, and then in the book of Hosea, chapter 12, that same man is referred to as an angel, right? Referred to as a malach, right? Where it says hamalachim, right? So there is a biblical precedence for these men also being referred to as angels. So that is why traditionally we have understood the three men who appeared to Abraham not as divine person or divine persons in any sort of way as they are equivalent with the creator of the universe, chas v'shalom. Rather, they are simply angels. There's no reason to necessitate that one of these angels must be God. There just simply isn't a precedent for that, especially in light of Deuteronomy chapter 4, in Deuteronomy chapter 13, right? Because, like I said, I can go to John chapter 14 and take the verses out of context and tell the Christian, look, Jesus is claiming to be not equivalent with God, and they would say I'm taking that out of context. Well, same with Genesis 18, right? They can look at Genesis 18 and say, oh, look, it looks like Abraham is talking to a physical human being in the form, of a man, and that's equivalent with God. It might appear that way if you isolate that passage away from passages like Deuteronomy chapter 4, which explicitly forbid the worship of any form, right? It says it twice. You saw no form when God spoke to you. It explicitly says that here in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 12. These are explicit commands. We don't have to play guessing games about who's a man, who's God, who's equivalent to... No, this is an explicit command. For all generations, it says that you shall teach this to your children, even when you go into the land of Israel. And I went into very extensive detail in this in my video with Sam Shamoon right here. Very interesting man. Not the most respectful, but you'll get what you need out of that video. And I go through the great Jesus angel hunt in more detail, and how there's no standard. They have zero standard as to how to identify a normal angel versus any other angel in the Tanakh, other than, well, there's no name here, so I guess Jesus gets dibs on this angel because everything is Jesus to a Christian. Right, and it's their same approach to messianic prophecy. They don't have a standard for what messianic prophecy is. Instead, they paint the target around the arrow, say bullseye, and for some reason they're impressed when they shouldn't be, because they've already made up their mind. They don't use the Tanakh as the standard of evidence. Same with this great Jesus angel hunt. It is a wild goose chase from beginning to end. So here's another interesting argument that's made, once again, completely different language being used, but let's find the passage that talks about the Lord raining fire out of heaven, right? And where it talks about, so this is where Lot is captured, he offers up his daughters. He's trying to escape Sodom and Gomorrah, and what ends up happening is these cities are destroyed, right? So when you look here in Genesis chapter 19, you see it says God's name, and it says, and the Lord caused to rain upon Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord in heaven. Now, it's interesting because Christians to this day, I will hear try to use this to try and argue for like some sort of like Trinitarian argument, right? So here in the first chapter of in Genesis 18, they're arguing that somehow Jesus or, God in the flesh is appearing to Abraham. And then all of a sudden, that same angel here in the Genesis 19 is in heaven and on earth. Like, you can see the theme here. They're just looking for anonymous ideas and what they would call pluralities, right? Because they're arguing for a Trinitarian understanding here. Well, I guess you only have two lords here, right? So this actually was addressed, ironically, in the Talmud, right? Regarding how to answer a heretic. So this is an ancient argument that Christians have been making against Jews. And it says, the Gemara relates, a certain heretic said to Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yossi, as it is written, and the Lord rained upon Sodom, upon Gomorrah, the brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven, Genesis 19:24. The heretic raised the question, it should have stated from him out of heaven, right? Because they're arguing for this multiplicity of persons in the Godhead that Christians always try to argue for. And it says, a certain launderer said to Rabbi Yishmael, leave him be, I will respond to him, as it is written. And Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, wives of Lamech. So you see that Lamech is used twice. Does that mean there's two Lamechs? It's just the way that it is used, right? And so this, he's quoting from Genesis 4:23. One can raise the question, should have been written, my wives, not the wives of Lamech. Rather, it is the style of the verse to speak in this manner. So the Christian is assuming there must be a Trinity, so let me see where the Lord is reigning from the Lord. And they ignore the possibility that this could simply be the manner of speech as it is used in Genesis 4:23, unless you want to argue that Lamech was two people and there were two Lamechs and his wives were married to two different men with the same name. So, right. So then it says he too it is in the style of the verse to speak in this manner, as in Genesis chapter 19, verse 24, with regard to the Lord raining fire and on the earth, and what it says here, fire and brimstone from the Lord in heaven. So it's been refuted, and the Christians still haven't, they still use the same old tire argument. That's why it gets very frustrating sometimes, is that even when you checkmate the Christian on these types of issues, they pretend like it didn't happen, and they decide, let's play checkers instead. You checkmate them, and then they decide to change the rules of the game. It's very frustrating, but there is a way to checkmate them, and I mean, the wisdom is already here. We already know how to do this. There's no necessity for a Trinity here, or Jesus to be one of these angels, or any of this. So then we go on to Genesis chapter 20. Abimelech, right? We have Yitzchak being born. And of course, as we get into the role of Yitzchak, of course, Christians get very excited about Yitzchak and the Akedah, which I believe is not in this Parsha, right? I don't believe it's here, but it's setting the stage for a very important part of, okay, well, actually, here we are. It says, go to Mount Moriah, right? Okay, so the Akedah is here. It's toward the end of the Parsha, right? So then you have, this part's interesting. It says, Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father. He said, my father. He said, here I am, my son. And he said, here are the fire and here's the wood, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? And of course, the Christian loves this line because it says, and Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And they went together. So how do you refute this argument, right? Because obviously the Christian says that, well, this was never fulfilled because Abraham ended up sacrificing a ram and not a lamb, right? After that, he saw a ram in the thicket of the thorns, and he offered it up. So they say, well, that prophecy wasn't fulfilled, so it must be Jesus, of course, because that's the only possible answer. Well, if you actually want to think critically about this, there is another answer that is very direct. If you go to Exodus chapter 12, which explicitly describes the first Passover, you have a commandment from God. It says, speak to the entire community of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, let each one take a lamb for each parental home and a lamb for each household. But if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his neighbor who is nearest to him shall take according to the number of people, and each according to one's ability to eat. You shall be counted for the lamb, and you'll have a perfect lamb in its first year, and may take it either from the sheep or the goats, and you shall keep it for inspection in the 14th day of the month, and the entire congregation shall slaughter it in the afternoon. There you go. There you go. And you shall put blood onto the doorposts, right? And in the houses in which they shall eat it. And on this night they shall eat the flesh roasted over the fire, and unleavened cakes. With bitter herbs they shall eat it. So, where's the lamb? There was the lamb. We have answers to these questions. The Christian assumes Jesus on every page. We have a burnt offering, literal, a lamb roasted over a fire. There is your lamb. No need for Jesus. I hope that this video has been a blessing to you. Shalom and God bless.